The comm station hummed with barely contained power as Darren activated the encrypted network. Thunderstrike's weight was familiar against his shoulder as the holographic displays flickered to life, showing faces etched with determination. His voice cut through pleasantries. Draven's forces hit the brownstone. They have Caleb and Evelyn. Argoz is with Rose at the Shadow Realm bar. The reaction was immediate. Ashley's hands tightened visibly on her enchanted 2140B, its runes pulsing with stored power. Clara's expression hardened into something dangerous, while Arundel's stern features carried the weight of centuries. Clara took command with practiced efficiency. Arundel, portal to the Shadow Realm. Ashley, you're running heavy support with the 240B. Darren, you're our point man. The wolves come with us. As if summoned by her words, Alpha, Beta, and Omega padded into the room. Their presence changed the very air, filling it with primal power. Alpha's eyes, gleaming with intelligence and barely contained fury, locked onto Clara. "This isn't just a rescue," Clara's voice rang with authority. "This is a message. Draven needs to learn what happens when he moves against the pack." Arundel's hands wove complex patterns in the air, each gesture precise and powerful. The portal took shape, its edges crackling with ethereal energy. Reality itself seemed to bend around the shimmering gateway. The team moved with practiced precision, weapons ready, expressions set. This wasn't just another mission. This was personal. As they stepped through the portal one by one, the air crackled with purpose and promised violence. The Shadow Realm bar thrummed with its usual energy, deals being struck in shadows, magical artifacts changing hands, supernatural beings masquerading as humans. But tonight was different. The fire-kissed runes on Rose's armor cast dancing shadows across her usual corner, each plate gleaming with barely contained power. Her fingers drummed against her coiled whip, its ember glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Argoz sat beside her, the celestial gem's light matching her nervous energy as she watched the door. The untouched drink before her trembled slightly with each opening of the bar's entrance. The patrons kept stealing glances at Rose. They knew her reputation, but seeing her in battle armor was like watching a legend come to life. The atmosphere shattered when Draven's captain entered. His presence seemed to devour light itself, an oppressive wave of darkness that made even the most hardened supernatural patrons step back. His boots echoed against the floor with deliberate menace as he approached, his glowing eyes fixed on Rose's bracelet like a predator spotting weakness. "Well, well," his voice dripped with malicious amusement. "The mighty Rose Emberheart, reduced to hiding behind a bar's protection." Rose didn't move except to lift her glass with calculated casualness. The liquid inside caught the light of her armor's runes as she took an unhurried sip. "Funny," her voice carried deadly amusement. "I was just thinking about the last time you were here. Remind me, how far did Silas's enforcers throw you?" The captain's smirk twisted with barely contained rage. He stepped closer, magical darkness coiling around him. "At least I still have my power. That bracelet suits you, a perfect leash for a rabid dog." A tremor of tension rippled through the bar. Argos's grip on the gem tightened, its light flaring in response to the threat. But Rose simply tilted her head, her smirk sharpening like a drawn blade. "And yet here you are," she purred, "prowling around my territory like a lost puppy begging for attention. I must really keep you up at night." The captain's jaw tightened briefly, his smug demeanor cracking for the barest moment. "You're not as clever as you think, Emberheart. You might fool these sheep, but I know what you are. You're nothing without that power you lost." Rose's eyes burned, but her smirk remained intact. She leaned forward slightly, her tone dropping to a near whisper. "Keep telling yourself that, Captain. Maybe it'll help you sleep at night." The captain straightened, his face twisting with barely concealed anger. He took a deliberate step back, his smirk returning. "I don't need to waste my time here. I just wanted to see the mighty Rose reduced to this." As he turned to leave, Rose's voice cut through the air like a blade. Leaving so soon? Didn't think you'd learned how to walk away after the last time. The bar erupted in a low murmur of laughter, several patrons snickering at her jab. The captain froze, his fists clenching at his sides, but he didn't turn around. Without another word, he strode out the door, his heavy boots echoing against the floor. The tension in the room lingered even after he was gone. Rose exhaled slowly, her fingers curling around her glass. "Well," she muttered, lifting it to her lips. That was entertaining. Argoz looked at her, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think he'll come back?" Rose set the glass down, her expression hardening. He never really left. The tension inside the Shadow Realm bar was suffocating. Rose stood at the edge of the room, her armor glowing faintly in the dim light. The mocking sound of the captain's voice carried through the open door, punctuated by the muffled groans of Caleb and Evelyn. Argoz sat frozen in her seat, her hands trembling as the gem pulsed faintly against her chest. Rose turned to Silas, her dark eyes blazing. "Where's the line?" Silas stepped forward, his expression grave. "The truce ends at the edge of my property, the sidewalk. Beyond that, I can't help you." Rose's lips curled into a dangerous smile. "Good. That's all I need to know." She strode toward the door, the patrons parting to let her through. As she stepped outside, the scene before her made her stomach churn. Caleb and Evelyn were bound tightly, their heads hanging low, their faces bruised. The captain stood in the middle of the street, a smug grin plastered across his face. Behind him, his men loomed, their weapons ready. "Rose!" the captain called, spreading his arms as though welcoming an old friend. "So good of you to join us. I brought a little display for you. Thought you might appreciate seeing your team up close before we take them back." Rose stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, her boots scuffing against the line where the truce held sway. She tilted her head, her smirk sharp and calculated. "Funny. I thought I smelled something rotten." The captain's grin widened as he gestured toward Caleb and Evelyn. "Go ahead, Emberheart. Step across. Try and save them. Or are you too scared of what'll happen?" Rose's hand tightened around the coiled whip at her side, the runes on her armor pulsing faintly. "You think you're so clever standing there just out of reach," she said, her tone deceptively casual. "But we both know you're all bark and no bite." One of the captain's enforcers growled, stepping forward. "Watch your mouth, witch!" Rose's smirk deepened. She took a deliberate step closer to the line, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "What's the matter? Scared of a little sidewalk?" The enforcer snarled, his fists clenching. He looked back at the captain, who gave a subtle shake of his head, but Rose's piercing gaze had already locked onto him, her tone dripping with mockery. "That's what I thought. All that armor. And you're too afraid to take a single step." The enforcer's patience snapped. With a guttural growl, he lunged forward, his boots crossing onto the sidewalk. The moment he did, the air crackled with energy, and Silas's voice rang out from the bar. "Violation of the truce!" In an instant, the enforcers of the bar moved, their towering forms emerging from the shadows. They seized the captain's man, dragging him back with inhuman strength. The enforcer struggled, shouting obscenities, but it was no use. The bar's rules were absolute. Rose didn't flinch. She took a slow, deliberate step toward Caleb and Evelyn, her whip uncoiling at her side. The captain's smile faltered as she stopped just shy of the line, her voice cold and cutting. "Your move, Captain. Unless you're too much of a coward to come closer." The captain's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. He glanced at his men, his expression calculating. Rose held her ground, her heart pounding as she calculated her next move. If she could just get Caleb and Evelyn to the sidewalk, they'd be safe. "Caleb," she called, her voice steady. "If you can hear me, you need to move. Just a little closer." Caleb stirred, his head lifting weakly. His eyes met hers, and she saw the flicker of recognition. "Evelyn," he rasped, his voice hoarse, We need to get to the sidewalk. The captain stepped forward, his smirk returning. Ah, he said, raising a hand. No one moves unless I say so. Rose tilted her head, her whip snapping once against the ground. The crack echoed through the street like a warning. You've already lost one man to the truce. How many more do you want to lose tonight? The captain's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Caleb shifted again, inching closer to the sidewalk. Evelyn, her face pale but determined, began to follow his lead. Good, Rose murmured, her voice barely audible. Just a little more. Rose's whip cracked through the air like a thunderclap, its fiery runes igniting in a blaze that lit up the dark street. The captain's smirk evaporated as the weapon snapped forward, wrapping tightly around Caleb's bound torso. With a sharp pull, Rose yanked him off the ground and onto the sidewalk, the truce's boundary enveloping him in an invisible shield of safety. "Argoz, now!" Rose shouted, her voice commanding. The gem around Argoz's neck pulsed, her goblin instincts and newfound speed surging to the forefront. In a blur, she darted toward Evelyn, dodging the captain's men with agility she didn't know she possessed. The mage's hand glowed as he cast a spell, but Argoz ducked low, narrowly avoiding the arcane blast. She scooped Evelyn into her arms and bolted back toward the sidewalk, her heart pounding in time with the gem's rhythm. The captain's roar of frustration echoed through the street as both hostages were pulled to safety. His glowing eyes locked on Rose, his hatred palpable. "You're going to regret that, Emberheart." Rose stepped off the sidewalk, the runes on her armor blazing like molten fire. "The only thing I regret is letting you leave here the first time." With a flick of her wrist, her whip snapped forward again, this time aimed directly at the captain. He barely managed to deflect it with his blade, the fiery strands leaving scorch marks on the steel. Rose advanced, her chaotic fire magic swirling around her like a storm. Two of the captain's enforcers charged, weapons raised, but Rose's hands ignited, and twin fireballs erupted from her palms, slamming into their chests. They flew backward, their armor glowing red-hot as they hit the ground, groaning in pain. The mage raised his staff, chanting a spell that caused the ground beneath Rose to crack and tremble. Flames shot up around her, but instead of recoiling, she absorbed them, the inferno feeding her power. Her laughter was sharp and wild as she turned her blazing gaze on him. "That all you've got?" she taunted, launching a fiery torrent his way. The mage raised a shield, but the force of her magic pushed him back, cracks forming in the barrier. As Rose fought like a force of nature, Argoz knelt beside Caleb and Evelyn. Caleb's face was pale, blood seeping from a gash on his side. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open, her face etched with pain but determination. "Argoz, what's happening?" Evelyn murmured weakly. "Stay still," Argoz said, her voice trembling. She ripped at the ropes binding them, her sharp claws cutting through the thick cords. The gem's light grew brighter, enveloping her hands and amplifying her strength. Behind them, the battle raged. The captain barked orders, his men rallying under his command. The mage cast a binding spell that wrapped around Rose's legs, rooting her in place for a moment. One of the enforcers took the opportunity to rush her, swinging a massive hammer. Rose snarled, her fiery aura exploding outward, breaking the magical bindings and sending the enforcer stumbling back. But the coordinated attacks were wearing on her. For every blow she landed, another came her way, forcing her to retreat a step at a time. The captain moved with calculated precision, staying just out of reach while directing his men. "Wear her down," he growled. "She's not invincible." As two more enforcers advanced on Rose, the mage's spells began to grow more aggressive, streaks of dark energy slicing through the air. One hit Rose's shoulder, sending her stumbling. The captain's smirk returned as he closed the distance, his sword gleaming in the dim light. Just as the tide seemed to turn fully against Rose, a low growl rumbled from the direction of the bar. The captain turned his head slightly, just in time to see a massive werewolf leap from the shadows, slamming into one of his men with bone-crushing force. The enforcer hit the ground unmoving. From another angle, a vampire streaked forward, a blur of motion that ended with the mage crying out in pain as her claws raked across his chest. The vampire hissed, her crimson eyes glowing as she turned to Rose. "Thought you could use a hand." Rose's lips curled into a feral grin, the fire in her eyes rekindling. About time someone around here had some guts. The air shimmered with energy as the portal opened in the middle of the street, its glowing edges crackling like lightning. The chaos of the battle froze for a split second, all eyes turning toward the swirling gateway. Through the portal stepped Clara, her hazel eyes blazing with determination, her staff of light glowing faintly in her hand. Omega padded close by her side, his sleek form radiating tension as the young wolf's bond with Clara pulsed with purpose. Behind them, Ashley emerged, her stance steady as she swung the enchanted 240B into position, its polished barrel gleaming in the dim light. Beta prowled beside her, her grey fur bristling, her yellow eyes scanning the street like a predator assessing her prey. Darren was the last to step through, Thunderstrike slung over his shoulder and a smirk tugging at his lips. Alpha padded next to him, the massive wolf's presence like a shadow of dominance and power. The air grew thick with anticipation as the pack took in the scene. Chaos reigned in the street. Draven's enforcers, battered but unyielding, regrouped near the mage, who clutched his staff with visible effort. Rose stood a few feet from the captain, her whip blazing as they circled each other, their standoff ready to explode at any moment. Caleb and Evelyn lay near the sidewalk, barely conscious but safe within the truce's boundary, with Argoz crouched protectively over them, her glowing gem a beacon of determination. Clara's voice was sharp and commanding. "Pack! Take positions! Wolves on me! Ashley, suppress the mage! Darren, deal with the enforcers!" The pack moved as one. The wolves strike. Omega bolted forward with the speed of a hurricane, his young energy harnessed by Clara's focused commands. The lieutenant raised his hand, weaving an intricate spell that shimmered like a net of silver light. As Omega darted under the spell's cover, he lunged at one of the enforcers, his powerful jaws locking onto an arm and dragging the foe to the ground. Beta was a blur of motion as she leapt onto another enforcer, her ferocious growl echoing through the street. Ashley followed close behind, the 240B roaring to life. The machine gun's enchanted rounds slammed into the mage's shield, the force of the blasts shaking the ground. The mage staggered, his defences cracking under the relentless barrage. Alpha moved like a shadow beside Darren, his massive frame a stark contrast to the man's cocky grin. "Looks like it's just you and me, big guy," Darren quipped, pumping Thunderstrike. He took aim and fired, the enchanted rounds sending another enforcer sprawling. Alpha darted toward another target, his movements precise and predatory. He circled one of the captain's remaining men, his growl low and menacing, before pouncing with brutal efficiency. Rose and the captain finally clashed, his blade slicing through the air as her whip cracked against it with fiery precision. Sparks flew as steel met fire, their battle a violent dance of skill and raw power. "You think you can stop me?" the captain sneered, his blade glinting in the firelight. "You're nothing but chaos pretending to be control." Rose's laugh was sharp and cold, her whip snapping around his wrist and yanking him off balance. "Chaos has its uses. You, on the other hand, are predictable." The captain growled, breaking free and swinging his blade in a wide arc. Rose ducked, flames erupting around her as she retaliated with a surge of fire magic that engulfed him briefly. He stumbled, his armor scorched but his resolve unbroken. The mage's last stand. As Ashley's machine gun fire tore through the mage's shield, the lieutenant stepped forward, his magic weaving through the air like threads of light. With a sharp gesture, he sent a binding spell hurtling toward the mage, locking his hands in place and rendering him vulnerable. Ashley seized the opportunity, her voice steady. Beta, move! The wolf leapt clear as Ashley unleashed another barrage, the enchanted rounds slamming into the mage and sending him crashing to the ground. The remaining enforcers faltered, their morale breaking as the mage's staff shattered with a crackling burst of energy. The street was a whirlwind of motion. The wolves moved seamlessly with their bonded partners, their instincts and coordination overwhelming Draven's men. The captain, now separated from his enforcers, was forced to fight Rose one-on-one, her fiery attacks pressing him back step by step. But as the battle raged, the captain's eyes gleamed with dark intent. "You can't protect them all," he growled, his gaze darting toward Caleb and Evelyn. The captain snarled as the tide of the battle turned against him. His remaining men lay scattered, battered by the coordinated assault of the pack and their wolves. Ashley's enchanted rounds had neutralized the mage, and the lieutenant's binding spells kept the remaining threats at bay. Rose's whip cracked again, the fire licking dangerously close to his face as he stumbled back, his armor scorched and his pride wounded. "You're done!" Rose growled, advancing like an inferno personified. "Give up, or I'll make sure you regret every breath you've taken." The captain's eyes darted around the battlefield, calculating his next move. His gaze locked onto Caleb and Evelyn, still weak and barely able to stand. A wicked grin spread across his face as his hand slipped into his belt pouch, retrieving a small, dark orb etched with glowing runes. "No!" Rose roared, her whip flashing toward him. But he was faster. With a vicious sneer, the captain hurled the orb directly at Evelyn and Caleb. "Let's see how you protect them now." Time seemed to slow as the orb sailed through the air, its malevolent energy pulsing with dangerous intent. Caleb, still barely able to stand, moved instinctively, throwing himself in front of Evelyn. "No!" he shouted, his arms spreading wide to shield her. But Argoz was faster. The gem around her neck flared with a blinding light, her goblin instincts and newfound power propelling her forward like a blur. She leapt between Caleb and the orb, her body twisting mid-air as the gem's light enveloped her completely. The orb struck her outstretched hand. There was a deafening explosion, the force of the blast shaking the street and sending shockwaves through the air. A blinding white light erupted, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. The roar of the explosion drowned out all other sounds, leaving the battlefield momentarily silent and disoriented. As the light faded and the echoes of the explosion subsided, the scene came back into focus. Argoz stood in the center of the devastation, the gem around her neck glowing brightly, its energy forming a protective barrier that shimmered faintly before dissipating. She was unharmed, though her expression was one of shock and confusion. Caleb and Evelyn stared at her in awe, their injuries forgotten for a moment as they took in what had just happened. "Argoz," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Rose lowered her hand from her eyes, her fiery aura dimmed but still present. Her gaze snapped to the spot where the captain had stood moments before. It was empty. "He's gone," Rose growled, her voice filled with frustration and rage. "The bastard used the blast as a cover." The wolves regrouped, their growls low and tense as they scanned the area. Clara stepped forward, her staff of light glowing faintly as she reached out with her magic. "There's no trace of him," she confirmed. "He's retreated." Argos's hands trembled as she looked down at the gem. Its light had dimmed, but she could still feel its power coursing through her. It protected me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rose approached, her whip coiled at her side, her expression softening slightly. "You saved them," she said, glancing at Caleb and Evelyn. "The gem isn't just some trinket. It's a part of you now." Argoz nodded slowly, the weight of her actions settling over her. "But he got away. I should have stopped him." "We'll deal with him," Clara said firmly, placing a hand on Argos's shoulder. "You did more than enough tonight." "Oh, you've found your way here, have you? Curious about what's next?" Pauses. "Good. because there's plenty more where this came from.
If you want to stay in the know, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications, unless of course you enjoy surprises. But something tells me you don't like being left in the dark. Go on, make sure you don't miss a thing, because once you're here, Whispers, there's no turning back.